The morning light crept across the widowed rancher's land the way it always did, slow, unforgiving, and honest, revealing every fence post that leaned a little more each year, every scar in the dry earth left behind by seasons that had taken more than they'd given. And Silas Boone stood on the porch of his weather-beaten ranch house, with a tin mug warming his hands, staring out at a world he had learned to endure rather than love, ever since death had taught him how quiet a home could become. 3 years had passed since his wife was buried on the hill overlooking the creek, yet some mornings still felt like the first day without her, raw and hollow. And this morning should have been no different until he heard the sound. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the soft, broken sound of someone trying very hard not to cry. It drifted from inside his kitchen, threading itself between the creak of the floorboards and the low hiss of the stove, and it stopped Silas mid-step in a way gunfire never had. He frowned, setting his mug down slowly, his instincts sharpening, because life had taught him that unexpected sounds usually meant trouble. He moved quietly, boots heavy but careful, and when he reached the kitchen doorway, what he saw made his breath catch in his chest. The girl, no, the young woman, stood at his stove, her back to him, shoulders trembling as she stirred a pot that steamed gently in the early light. Her dress too thin for the work she did, her hands red from heat and labor, and tears slid down her cheeks unchecked, dripping silently into nothing but the floor she scrubbed every night. She didn't know he was there. She didn't hear him. She was too busy breaking apart inside a room that wasn't hers, cooking food she might never taste, in a house where she had been told to be grateful just for being allowed to stay. Her name was Clara, though most people spoke it like it didn't matter, like she didn't. She had arrived 2 weeks earlier in the back of a supply wagon, half-starved, eyes too old for her years, carrying a single bundle of belongings and a past she never spoke of. The foreman had called her extra help, the kind you didn't ask questions about, and Silas, tired, busy, and numb, had nodded and let her stay, offering a bed in the small room off the kitchen and work in exchange for meals and cleaning. He hadn't meant to ignore her. He just hadn't known how to see anyone clearly. After losing the woman who had once been the center of his world, now watching Clara cry as she cooked, something deep and buried inside him stirred, something like anger, something like shame. He cleared his throat softly, and Clara jumped, nearly dropping the spoon, her eyes wide with panic as she spun around, hastily wiping her face with her sleeve, forcing a smile that didn't belong on a girl who looked like she hadn't slept a full night in years. "I'm sorry." "Sir," she said quickly, voice tight, already bracing herself for reprimand. "I didn't mean to. I'll have breakfast ready soon." "I swear it." Silas felt the words hit him like a slap, not because of what she said, but because of what she expected him to do. He leaned against the doorframe, studying her properly for the first time. The faint bruise on her wrist she tried to hide, the way she flinched when he shifted his weight, the exhaustion etched into every small movement. "You ain't in trouble," he said slowly, his voice rough from disuse, from years of saying only what was necessary. Clara nodded too fast, like she didn't believe him, and turned back to the stove, stirring harder than needed, as if working faster might erase whatever weakness he'd seen. Silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable, until Silas broke it in a way that surprised even himself. "Why were you crying?" The spoon paused. Clara's shoulders stiffened. For a long moment she said nothing, and Silas almost told himself to let it go, to retreat back to his porch and his solitude. But then she spoke, barely above a whisper. "I don't know," she lied. He knew it was a lie because it was the same one he used whenever anyone asked. How he was doing. He crossed the kitchen slowly, careful not to crowd her, and took the spoon gently from her hand, setting it aside. Clara froze, fear flashing across her face, but he didn't touch her again. He just stood there, between her and the stove, blocking nothing but giving her something she clearly wasn't used to, space without threat. "You don't have to pretend here," he said quietly. "Not in my house." The words seemed to undo something in her, Her chin trembled. Her eyes filled again, and this time she didn't stop the tears. They came fast, silent sobs racking her thin frame as she pressed her fists to her mouth, trying to hold herself together. And Silas realized, with a sharp ache, that she had probably learned long ago that crying only made things worse. He didn't rush her. He didn't tell her to calm down. He just waited because grief had taught him that some pain needed room to breathe. When she finally spoke, her words spilled out in broken pieces. She told him about the farm she'd run from, about the man who'd promised work and delivered cruelty, about nights locked in barns and mornings where she was reminded she owed more than she could ever repay. She told him she cooked because it was the only thing she'd ever been praised for, and even that praise had come with conditions. She told him she cried because she didn't know how long she was allowed to stay before being sent away again. Silas listened, jaw clenched so tight it ached, his hands curling into fists at his sides, not at her, but at a world that seemed determined to break the gentle ones first. When she finished, she waited for the verdict she expected: dismissal, judgment, distance. Instead, Silas pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "No one's ever going to hurt you here," he said, the promise surprising him with its certainty. Clara stared at him like she didn't understand the language. "You're safe," he repeated. "As long as you're under my roof." The room felt different after that, like something invisible had shifted. Clara nodded slowly, hope and fear wrestling behind her eyes, and Silas stood, clearing his throat again. "Sit," he said gently, gesturing to the chair. "I'll finish breakfast." She hesitated, then obeyed, watching him like he might disappear if she blinked. As he stirred the pot she'd been crying over just moments before, Silas felt something he hadn't felt since his wife died. Not happiness. Not yet, but purpose. And as the sun climbed higher outside the window, lighting the dust in the air like floating gold, neither of them knew that this small moment, this simple act of noticing, was the first step toward changing both their lives forever. The days after that morning unfolded differently than any Silas Boone could remember, not because the ranch suddenly grew easier or the work lighter, but because the silence inside his house changed its shape, filling with small, living sounds that reminded him of what it meant to share space with another soul. Clara moved through the kitchen with less fear now. Though it hadn't vanished entirely, it lingered in the way she still startled at raised voices outside, in how she asked permission before doing even the smallest thing. And Silas noticed it all with a quiet attentiveness that surprised him. He found himself waking earlier, lingering longer at the breakfast table, asking simple questions he'd once believed unnecessary. Had she slept well? Did her hands hurt from scrubbing? Did she like the bread softer or crisp? Clara answered cautiously at first, as though kindness were a trick waiting to turn sharp. But slowly, day by day, her voice grew steadier, her eyes lifting more often to meet his. Word spread fast on a ranch, and the men noticed too. The girl who once kept her head down now walked with a little more confidence, and Silas made it clear, without raising his voice or drawing a gun, that she was to be treated with respect. It was said once, calmly, and never tested again. But safety, Silas learned, wasn't just about protection from others. It was about giving someone the freedom to become who they were meant to be. He began teaching Clara things beyond cooking: how to read ledgers, how to write properly, how to judge the weather by the color of the sky, and in return, she brought life back into corners of the ranch he hadn't realized were dying. She sang softly while she worked. Not sad songs, but hopeful ones. And sometimes Silas would pause outside the kitchen, listening, feeling something inside his chest loosen. One evening, as the sun bled red across the plains, Clara stood beside him on the porch and asked about the grave on the hill. He told her about his wife, about laughter and loss, about love that didn't disappear when someone did, and Clara listened the way people listen when they truly understand pain. She didn't offer pity, she offered presence. And in that moment, Silas realized healing wasn't something that arrived all at once. It came quietly, in shared meals, in unspoken understanding. in choosing compassion when bitterness would have been easier. Trouble came as it always does, when the past tried to reclaim what it believed it owned. But Silas stood firm, and Clara stood with him, no longer trembling. When the dust settled, it was clear to everyone, including Clara herself, that she was no longer a girl waiting to be discarded. She was family. Months later, the kitchen where she once cried became the warm heart of the ranch, filled with light, laughter, and the kind of peace that can only be earned. And Silas, the widowed rancher who once believed his life had ended with loss, learned that sometimes God doesn't restore what was taken. He sends something new to protect, to grow, and to love.